Africa, the second largest continent, is a land of many wonders and mysteries. It is nicknamed as the Mother Continent due to its being the oldest inhabited land on Earth. Humans and their ancestors have lived in Africa for more than 5 million years. It is a land of rich diversity in nature, with almost every kind of habitat from the dry and scarce deserts of Sahara to the humid and abundant rainforests of Congo. From the low and arid plains of the western savanna to the high mountains of the eastern highlands, it has a vast diversity in cultures, languages, traditions, and customs of the various tribes inhabiting Africa. Africa was also nicknamed the Dark Continent by Welsh journalist and explorer Henry Morton Stanley, who saw Africa as mysterious. Its landscapes and cultures were largely unknown to many outsiders until the late 19th century. The lack of knowledge of major and minor complex accomplishments of the African people continues today. When we talk about punishments in ancient Africa, one usually tends to think of unimaginably cruel or savage forms of punishments. Africa has been discriminated against due to its mysterious nature and considered as a land of lawless savage tribes. However, it cannot be farther from the truth. Africa has been home to some of the earliest and most successful ancient empires in history, such as the empires of Egypt, Kush, Aksum, Abyssinia, Ghana, Kanem-Bornu, and the contesting South African kingdoms. The entire continent was also spanned by vast communal territories declared as homes of tribes. Such communal territories spanned about thousands of kilometers, and the tribes would always be moving from one place to another in their own territories. Needless to say, as each tribe had a way of formally governing its boundaries with recognition from other tribes, the African cultures also had a system of laws and punishment. The system of law and punishments in ancient Africa is not based upon written records. For many offenses of varying significance, particular sanctions were not laid down in advance, but penalties depended on the circumstances of each individual case. There were virtually no fixed sentences for fixed crimes. Besides the heavy sanctions such as capital punishment and banishment, there were milder ones like fines, compensation, and restoration. There were also less severe punishments against the violations of rules of the land, and which may take different forms, such as minimal fines and levies, suspension and expulsion of members from particular groups within the tribe. African indigenous justice paid attention to the plight of the victim of crime. It ensured that the crime victim is returned to the position as nearly as possible, which he was before the crime was committed. Hence, it employed the principle of restorative justice in its punishment. Restitution relates to the return or restoration of movable property either stolen or otherwise dishonestly acquired. Contrary to public opinion, the judicial system in African tribes has always been peaceful and amicable. African tribes employ a tripartite approach to criminal justice, focusing on the interests of the victim, the community, and the offender as well. Among the Bantu people of Kenya, punishment is administered publicly, the townspeople being called to witness it, so as to operate on their fears and cause them to dread the doing of deeds which may bring on them such a penalty. For the Bantus, all misdeeds and offenses, even capital ones, may be condoned by a fine in goods, except only the murder of a man. In such instances, the murderer must forfeit his life. In the Yoruba culture of Nigeria, social crimes attract punishments such as flogging, whipping, tying, putting in the stocks or yoke, lacerating wounds, banishment, or castration depending on damage done by the criminal. In cases of severe crimes, even in unlawful killing of a human being, the payment of compensation or blood money by the offender to the offended was customary. Among the Basoga and Baganda of Uganda, while cases of intentional murder were rare, the death penalty could be exacted by the deceased relatives, but the general punishment was the payment of blood money as well. Also, generally no punishment was inflicted on a man who killed his wife or his slave, for he is seen as disposing of his property, and no one has suffered any loss which calls for compensation. Across all African tribes, offenses such as murder, treason, and witchcraft were considered much more serious than the others and often attract the death penalty or banishment from the tribal territories. African traditional societies consider murder a very grievous act that must not be left unpunished. The most common forms of execution included hanging, beheading, stoning, drowning, burying alive, and killing by the identical means used by the murderer. Witchcraft was the most serious crime in African indigenous society. It involved the threat of use of powerful medicines, magic, and the supernatural for harmful ends. It is like poison among us. It was so sinister because the victim would have no idea of what or who was causing the problem. The suspected witch had no opportunity to defend himself and no redress. Witchcraft being by definition a secret affair, said to be exercised even unconsciously by witches during their sleep, the suspect's denials availed him nothing. His only hope was to confess to witchcraft and to utter mysterious threats, which would make people fear to take action against him. In most cases, this was a short-term defense and played into the hands of the accusers. Even where it was successful, the suspect became a virtual outcast, isolated from his surrounding community. As the powers of witches were feared among society, they were usually banished to exile outside the limits of the community territories. Banishment was regarded as an equivalent of the death penalty due to the fact that it might lead to attacks by animals or to capture by slave dealers. While the tribes of Africa were some of the most amicable people, the empires of Africa were not as civilized as one may think. Any empire is driven by the ruling power's whims and fancies, which leads to laws and punishments which may be cruel or even absurd at times. The empires in Africa were no different than the rest. In ancient Egypt and Eastern Africa, adultery was considered as a grievous sin and punishable by the most absurd methods. The couple which has committed adultery would be forced to be naked and get into a coital position in a pit, which would be filled with sand and dirt to bury them alive. Talk about one last romp before you go. Eastern African punishment for adultery was even more bizarre. The criminal was punished by anal impalement. Although the name sounds like a quick and painful death with a sharp-pointed wooden spike for a seat, the real punishment was a long-drawn and slow, painful process with a wider, thick, blunt pole. The blunt pole would be embedded in the ground and the top smeared with grease, and the criminal would be put on top of the pole. The pole slips further in slowly due to the weight of the body pushing organs to the side and causing internal damage. Not to mention the fact that the grease and blood would attract insects who could eat their way into the wounds. Comment down below and let us know if you would like to find out about the horrific and bizarre punishments of ancient Egypt. Africa is still a land that is shrouded by misinformation and prejudice imposed by the colonial powers. We still have not learned to appreciate the true beauties of the mystery of the diverse nature and culture of the land that is the origin of humans as we know today. Stay tuned to find out more about the ancient African empires, exploring the dark parts of history. This is Time Capsule. Please like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications so you don't miss out. Thank you for watching. See you again next time on Time Capsule.